I do mention it towards the end. I do try to tie in that we need to be doing those kinds of studies. We need to move from theory to actually trying to work on problems which preoccupy our colleagues that aren't convinced by what we're doing. We need to actually say, hey, we can solve this problem in ways which are perhaps unexpected because we're using these approaches. I've given a longer title to my paper, Memory, Media, and Informed Criticism Towards a New Model for the Synoptic Tradition. When it comes to memory and media, pretty much everything of importance has been said by Samuel Bierstock and Reuben Zimmerman, in my view, in their various publications on this topic. This paper is full of footnotes to their work. I have written recently on the interface between cognition and cultural media, but that is not what I want to talk about today. What I will do is argue that the intimate connection between memory and cultural media entails a fundamentally new account of the origins and history of the Jesus tradition. I've been puzzling over why memory approaches applied so unproblematically for 20, 30 years already in other disciplines in the social sciences and humanities have met with some resistance and controversy in New Testament scholarship, particularly in historical Jesus debates. Perhaps the suspicion is that memory approaches are being used to smuggle in a priori claims about the reliability of the tradition accounts for this, some of this. I believe a major cause of the standoff, however, is that we have not articulated very well that memory entails not just new historiographies for Jesus research, but an entirely new model for the Jesus tradition. Our historiographical claims don't make sense to colleagues who still view the tradition through lenses provided by the classical form critical model for the origins of the history and its origins of the tradition and its development. Memory and media, why pair them together? Why does it matter? Nothing less is at stake than two competing accounts of the Jesus tradition. Memory theory is not just an additional tool in our scholarly toolbox that adds some nuance to our tradition history and redaction history analyses, as some suggest. Rather, it provides a basis for a comprehensive account of the origins and history of the Jesus tradition, one that displaces the old form critical model while incorporating, indeed, giving a better explanation of form criticism's great insights. This is because of the essential connection that exists between memory and media. Form criticism got certain big things right. It recognized tradition was mediated by a repertoire of small forms in cultural genres such as apothegms or creeds. It recognized the powerful effects of the present community realities and concerns, the Sitzenleben, upon the tradition. It recognized the autonomy of the tradition, that is, its remarkable tendency to run its own independent course. But form criticism got one very big thing wrong. It profoundly misunderstood the relationship between memory and the tradition. It posited a disconnect, a categorical distinction between the two. Memory was a null factor in the history of the tradition. Oddly, Altman opposed eschatological consciousness to historical consciousness. I say oddly because eschatology is in fact a way of perceiving history. Orientation to the past arose only secondarily, he claimed, after exhaustion of the early community's eschatological enthusiasm. The gospel tradition was the product of the present enthusiastic life of the eschatological communities. Moreover, form criticism conceived memory narrowly as individual reminiscence, as personal eyewitness recollection. Since the phenomenological profile of individual eyewitness testimony manifestly does not correspond to the standardized impersonal forms of the synoptic tradition, the form critics and their followers assumed that memory and tradition were incommensurable. They were different kinds. David Needham, in a two-part essay published in 1958 and 1960, was the most explicit about this. To be sure, it was acknowledged that some early contact with eyewitness memory was likely. Indeed, this is what accounts for the presence of authentic elements in the tradition. These authentic elements are memory residues. Hence, Verede's programmatic question, how do we separate what belongs properly to Jesus from what is the material of the primitive community? Or Bultmann's claim that underlying the Passion narrative was, quote, a short narrative of historical reminiscence about the arrest, condemnation, and execution of Jesus, which had been overgrown and disfigured by legend. We note here how he equates historical with reminiscence and then distinguishes both from developments in the tradition. Curiously, the nature of this initial contact with memory and how it came to leave authentic residues in the tradition was left completely untheorized by the form critics. And I would say it's still neglected today. Perhaps even in our discussion so far in this conference. This is because for them, memory, at least as they conceived it, was of such a complete inconsequence for the tradition and its history. Moreover, these memory residues, such as they were inert with respect to developments in the tradition. Assigned weak agency, or no agency at all, memory was completely marginalized vis-a-vis other forces generating the tradition and driving its development. Boltman acknowledged, in a footnote, that, quote, memories of Jesus, his words and deeds, played their part in the literary productions of the early church, end quote. But he assigned these, viewed as individual recollections, no significant role in the formation of the tradition. The development of the tradition was driven by virtually every other force except the salient past itself. Boltman argued that the tradition was emergent in sociological forces immanent in the various Sitz and Leben. Observing the often close fit of the tradition and its characteristic forms with social factors and theological concerns of the early communities, form critics inferred the tradition was mostly invention, the attempt to legitimize contemporary practices and doctrine by projecting them back onto the sacred past. I want you to know, I think there's a very large element of truth in that, right? So I'm not trying to rehabilitate the individual recollection view, okay? I think this is part of their insight, but I think they are drawing their own inferences from it. We see that the radical discounting of the memory factor is not a sideline issue, but crucial to the entire form critical account of the tradition. But the master premise of this account, the generative correlation of tradition forms to Sitzenleben, has not survived criticism. As Martin Buss puts it, quote, the idea that a genre or a form arises from a typical spatio-temporal setting, that is Sitzenleben, is largely mistaken. Christopher Tuckett points out that, quote, different forms can be used in any one setting, and the same form can be used in different settings. The cultural repertoire of genres pre-exists any Sitzenleben in which they might find application. Buss notes that, quote, that the lack of, quote, a precise match between oral speech forms and concrete settings had been pointed out to biblical scholars by folklorists in 1926, but this was largely ignored. The homeostatic functionalist model that makes the tradition the isomorph of contemporary social realities is not defensible. Clifford Geertz points out that a cultural tradition and contemporary social structures are in fact distinct, interdependent variables that, more often than not, exist in some tension with each other. The other force supposedly driving the form critical history of the tradition, innate laws driving, quote, its imminent urge to development, likewise have long fallen by the wayside. These criticisms of form criticism are hardly new. What is less often remarked, however, is that severing the generative connection between sociological Sitz and the forms of the tradition leaves form criticism marooned without any viable explanation, any viable mechanism for the origin and history of the tradition. Form critical assumptions nevertheless continue to operate in different spheres of gospel scholarship. This attests to its remarkable power as a cognitive paradigm, an episteme. This is to say that it is not so much itself an object of reflection as it is a cognitive framework that determines the production of knowledge in synoptic scholarship. In fact, it is the case that memory, wholly marginalized by form criticism, in its cognitive, social, and cultural dimensions, is nothing less than the vital force that drives the formation of the tradition and its history. Samuel Bierskov points out that form criticism erred fundamentally in conceiving early Christian identity as unconnected to the past, but instead generated by contemporary sociological realities, when in fact, identity, personal and corporate, is the product of a negotiation of past and present. It arises out of the ongoing encounter of memory with the temporal and social horizons of the present. The Sitzenleben of the early communities, the incubators of the tradition, and form critics were right about that. The Sitzenleben of the early communities, the incubators of the tradition, are not the memory-free zones of form criticism, but zones of memory, the Gedächtnisort, as Ruben Zimmerman puts it. They are constituted of the recurrent activities in which the normative past and present exigencies encounter one another. But this encounter with the normative past is mediated by the tradition. But the tradition at the same time participates in this encounter. It is the product of this encounter. Accordingly, our grand talk of memory should be able to deliver a comprehensive, precise account of the tradition. Form criticism purported to do this. This was and continues to be its great attraction. The grounds for a memory-based account of the tradition lie in the reality that memory is always mediated in a cultural repertoire of genres and narrative forms. To illustrate, we will focus on narrative. Narrative is a basic cognitive organizing structure for memory. The strukturelle und mediale Grundform der Verarbeitung von Vergangenheit, again quoting Ruben. Bultmann could not have been more mistaken in assigning primacy to the sayings in his evolutionary history of the tradition. Memory is an active faculty that organizes the past in meaningful narrative patterns. He, quote, acts to organize what otherwise might be a mere assemblage of contingently connected events. I'm quoting there from Edward Casey, who's a philosopher, phenomenological philosopher. Through narrative, moreover, memory interprets, it signifies the past. To this end, it always draws upon a repertoire of existing narrative patterns and genres with culturally symbolic status. Let me give an example drawn from an important essay by Barry Schwartz. The arrest and then subsequent prosecution of American civil rights pioneer Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her seat on the bus to a white passenger, I believe this was 1955, was a complex historical episode. In fact, Schwartz points out that historically, Rosa Parks is not even the first African-American woman to refuse to give up her seat on the bus and to be arrested and prosecuted for it. And some of these other women were quite upset. All right, so you already see there's a gap going between what, historical events and what, the narrative, memorial representation of this. Okay, so the connection between history and memory is there, but it's complex, okay? But the Rosa Parks story, as such as it was a complex, the whole history of her, of the event, including the very complex history of her prosecution and so forth. It was condensed to the simple symbolic narrative of the wronged innocent, which has what, culturally resonant status. It's part of our cultural repertoire, it's a trope. This symbolically dense narrative then served and continues to serve as the basis for identity formation for groups that tell and retell the story. Here we see the intimate and certainly complex relationship between narrative as a basic medium for memory and the emergence of a tradition, I should say as well, the complex relationship of both with the actual historical event. In this connection, memory itself only emerges in coherent, durable form to the extent remembrances are communicated interactively in social contexts. Gerard Namer gives the example of concentration camp survivors that were only able to form coherent memories of their experiences, so horrible as to be incommunicable, through the collective discourse of survivor groups. By this means, what were fragmented, individualized remembrances were knit into a coherent narrative memory of the camps that also explore the significance of those experiences. In refugee camps in Tanzania, anthropologist Lisa Malki observed Hutu refugees fleeing the 1972 genocide in Burundi. Especially, their face-to-face discussions with one another about their horrific experiences. She describes these discussions as, quote, an intensely signifying context. the effect of which was to weave memory into semantically dense narrative patterns. These took on what she calls standardized versions that became moral ordering stories in the symbolic universe of the refugees. In other words, Malky was observing the formation of tradition in real time. To be mediated into the social realm, memory must be given intelligible, communicable form. To this end, memory is conformed to genre types and narrative patterns drawn from the cultural repertoire. Bruner and Feldman explained that memory, quote, becomes public by being based upon narrative properties such as genre and plot type that are widely shared within a culture. In this way, private experiences are constituted meaningfully in public and communicable form, end quote. Narrative patterns and cultural genres are not just empty containers for memory. Rather, they contribute constructively and dialectically to the formation and signification of memory. The wrong, innocent narrative pattern not only gave form to the contingent episodes connected to Rosa Parks' arrest and prosecution, it made a claim about the symbolic, moral meaning of those events. As Samuel Bierschot points out, the Crea is the narrative genre fitted for distilling out the normative, ethical element of memory. Culturally shared genres are the media for memory. They bridge, therefore, from memory to tradition. They have, again in Rubens' words, eine Tradition stiftend et Funktion. We see that memory is not a rote faculty that merely registers and archives events. Rather, it distills out the meaning, the moral and existential significance of experienced events. It's casting in genres and narrative patterns that connect it into the wider matrix of cultural signification, mightily conducive to this. Commemorative remembering in a community, the context for the emergence of a normative tradition, converges on elements of the past that are salient to the moral identity of the commemorating community. Barry Schwartz writes that, quote, commemoration is selective, highlighting an event's most significant moral features. It is important to recognize that this entails a certain distancing and abstraction of memory and the cultural forms in which it is mediated from the historical events that are its ultimate grounds. Sarah Farmer points out in the case of the Ordures-sur-Glane massacre, that, quote, the events had to be removed from their historical context and dramatized, visually and in narrative, be rendered suitable for telling the archetypal story of innocence and victimization. The Rosa Parks narrative serves as a foundational tradition for the American civil rights movement. It operates as a cultural symbol, a bearer of dense meaning, abstracted from the historical events that are its grounds. Indeed, it is only by virtue of its abstraction from the actual historical events that it receives its symbolic power to form a particular moral, Indeed, it is only by virtue of its abstraction from the actual events that it receives its symbolic power to form a particular moral identity in every new context of reception. The same is true of the Jesus tradition, which is neither calibrated nor concerned for a direct redescription of historical events. Rather, it amounts to the conversion, through complex cognitive and cultural operations, of the diffuse actualities of historical events into forms of cultural media that bear the axiomatic meanings and norms of the Jesus communities. This is the much remarked autonomy of the tradition. The form critics identified this property, but they misunderstood it. They thought it confirmed the tradition's disconnect from memory and history, that the tradition is more about present realities than past realities. But here as elsewhere, the opposite is the case. The tradition's autonomy is the corollary of its existence as a symbolic representation of foundational events. Like any cultural object, it leads a cultural life of its own, as it reacts with the social and historical contingencies of its traded communities. It is by virtue of its autonomy, that is, its abstraction from, and hence representational relationship to, the historical events that are its grounds, that tradition receives its power to form a particular cultural and moral identity across time and in every changing context of reception. This also accounts for the tradition's property of variation. For mediating the normative past, the tradition semantically interacts with the social and historical realities of the different contexts of reception. Its existence in cultural media, be it linguistic, narrative, ritual, or visual forms, gives it a tangible presence in context of reception. At the same time, it makes it available for fresh configurations within these contexts and symbolic exploitation. It is tractable. We see that memory is nothing less than the vital principle in the origins of the tradition and its history. The gospel tradition is the artifact of the cognitive, cultural, and social operations of memory. Memory provides the basis for a comprehensive account of the tradition because memory requires cultural mediation. This begins at the cognitive level and continues through to the emergence of a normative tradition out of the commemorative activities of the community. This is the antithesis of the form critical conception, which assigned memory a peripheral role at best. But this should not be taken as a full-scale rejection of form criticism. It's a plea not to. The form critics got much right about the tradition. But in disconnecting the tradition from memory, they got the one big thing wrong. The memory model does not displace the form critical model so much as it moves the memory factor from the periphery to the center. Memory-grounded analysis delivers a more adequate, more economical explanation of the phenomena observed by the form critics, the tradition's circulation in small forms and genres, its lack of obvious traces of personal eyewitness memory, its capacity for autonomous development, its curious patterns of variation and agreement, its profound connection to the present concerns of the trading communities, to the Sitzungsleute. Memory-grounded analysis is able to deliver a coherent account, not only of the tradition's origins, but of its history, through its analysis of how the tradition mediates the salient past into contemporary contexts of reception. Nevertheless, we have work to do to demonstrate the value-added element that a memory-grounded account of the tradition brings to standard scholarly practices such as redaction criticism, tradition history, and source criticism. Paul Foster's criticism on this point is a fair one. At a recent conference, I heard a paper, a fine paper, that purported to be an application of memory approaches, though it seemed to differ little from a standard redaction critical analysis. When I raised this, the presenter came back to me later with the question, well, how should it be done then? I confess I had to pause and reflect. Okay? So I'm guilty, okay? Making claims, but not showing how it works out in practice. I think that's what we need to do. A memory-based account of the tradition, I came back to something like this. I ended up pointing out to him that in such analysis, the powerful vector of the past will be given its full due. He was really just talking about present influences of the community upon a kind of passive tradition. And anyway, a memory-based account of the tradition does not so much displace these standard approaches as deepen them, makes them multidimensional rather than one-dimensionally about present community factors acting upon a past tradition. And actually Adele Reinhartz was attending the same conference. She spoke up and very clearly expressed how memory theory deepens and fills out redaction critical analysis. She did so well, so eloquently, I wish I had recorded it, because I can't even reproduce what she said. There's no coincidence that Adele's scholarship was very much aware of the cultural resonance of tradition. She understands its wider implications and cultural implications. Anyway, path-breaking work such as Jens Schroeder's Erinnerung an Jesu Worte, Anthony Ledunn's historiography, and Chris Keith's Jesus Against the Scribal Elite, just to mention some, show that memory-grounded analysis dissolves the boundaries between tradition history, redaction criticism, source criticism, and historiography. In the forthcoming monograph, I try to show how memory and media factors can give new leverage on synoptic source critical problems. Moreover, because memory studies are inherently interdisciplinary, it naturally facilitates an interdisciplinary analysis of the gospel tradition. Memory has the potential to be a kind of unified field theory for the analysis of the tradition. I think the reception project will go a long ways towards fleshing out memory-based analyses on the ground level actual analyses of the tradition. The epicenter of the dispute over memory approaches, however, seems to be historical Jesus research. I feel resistance has arisen on this front, in part because our applications to historiography, path-breaking as they are, have neglected the problem of the tradition. Chris Keith disagrees strenuously with me on this point. And of course, the two go together. There's historiography, memory-based historiography at least works with an implicit understanding of the tradition. I don't think it's been articulated very well. I believe this helps explain why memory approaches are running into some resistance. Because it has not fully worked out its account of the origins of the history of the tradition, it runs into problems competing with historiographical approaches grounded in the very well worked out form critical account, which, as we noted, has all the force of a cognitive paradigm. That said, a memory-based account of the tradition certainly has consequences for historiography. Right? Memory theory does not give privileged access to the historical Jesus, does not pre-authenticate the historical reliability of the Jesus tradition, any more than memory's so-called distortions hopelessly contaminate the tradition at its source. What it does is clarify how the tradition mediates the past. It addresses the form critical model, it addresses defects in the form critical model that put historical Jesus research on the wrong footing. As Chris points out, a memory-grounded model overcomes the form critical bifurcation of the tradition, its dualism of authentic and inauthentic elements, while still being able to make differentiating distinctions among the materials of the tradition. It is able to give an historical account of the relationship of the various elements of the tradition to one another. Conventional Jesus historians cannot clarify the relationship of the so-called authentic and inauthentic elements in the tradition to one another. Moreover, in putting the stark question, as Paul Foster phrases it, did Jesus do or not do, or say or not say some reported tradition? That is, looking for pristinely historical elements in the tradition. They do not reckon adequately with the very complex relationship of any unit of the tradition with historical realities. And just to be fair to Paul, his actual quote is, did Jesus do or say some reported tradition? And I amplified it by saying, did Jesus do, brackets, or not do, or say or not say some reported tradition? And I confess that. If Paul ever catches wind of this, he can correct me on that, and I'll try to justify it. But I felt that was the drift of it, that this is what we're up to. Did Jesus do or not do this? That's the quest. And I don't feel that adequately recognized that any unit of the tradition has a very complex relationship to the historical realities. Boltman assumed that symbolic representation and historical representation were mutually exclusive. The calling of the disciples, he said, is in no sense an historical record, but a description of an ideal scene. He put these two in antithesis to each other. Theodore, Whedon, Burton, Mack, and others equate the presence of conventional plot structure, such as the suffering righteous in the Passion narrative, with complete fabrication. Well, I think the story of Rosa Parks falsifies that view. The opposite is the case. It's symbolic and plotment gives crucial information about how the death was perceived and interpreted. There are rich historical inferences to be drawn from, critical historical inferences to be. And memory-based historiography is able to give a causal historical account of connections among elements of the tradition. It is able to exploit the tradition as a whole to form historical Jesus judgments. This enterprise will be more persuasive, however, when it is better integrated with a comprehensive, memory-grounded account of the origins of the tradition and its history.